Fireside Tailes with Wolfgang, Episode 9. Originally broadcast on GWC Productions YouTube channel, CAPS Media Television Channel 6, KPPQ LP Ventura at 104.1 FM, and on the KPPQ Podcast Network. Greetings and salutations. I'm Hunter Ackerman, here to read some classic literature for you. Let's just try that again. Greetings and salutations. I'm Hunter Ackerman, here to read you some classic literature with my feline companion. I just bumped the mic stand. Going again. Greetings and salutations. I'm Hunter Ackerman, here to read some classic literature for you and my beastly feline companion Wolfgang. So, Wolfus, what do you want to hear? In this story, there is a cat named Pibb. I have no idea if the creators of Mr. Pibb were Alcott fans, but they do indeed end up referring to the cat as Mr. Pibb, and bear that in mind. Much like Wolfgang, Mr. Pibb is quite opinionated. This is A Happy Birthday by Louisa May Alcott. A certain fine old lady was 73 on the 8th of October. The day was always celebrated with splendor by her children and grandchildren, but on this occasion, they felt that something unusually interesting and festive should be done because Grandma had lately been so very ill that no one thought she would ever see another birthday. It pleased God to spare her, however, and here she was, almost as well and merry as ever. Some families do not celebrate these days and so miss a great deal of pleasure, I think. But the people of whom I write always made a great deal of such occasions, and often got up very funny amusements, as you will see. As Grandma was not very strong, some quiet fun must be devised this time, and the surprises sprinkled along through the day, lest they be too much for her if they all burst in upon her at once. The morning was fine and clear, and the first thing that happened was the appearance of two little ghosts, all in white, who came prancing into the old lady's room while she lay placidly watching the sunrise and thinking of the many years she had seen. "A happy birthday, Grandma!" cried the little ghosts, scrambling up to kiss the smiling old face in the ruffled nightcap. There was a great laughing and cuddling and nestling among the pillows before the small arms and legs subsided and two round rosy faces appeared, listening attentively to the stories Grandma told them till it was time to dress. Now, you must know that there were only 2 grandchildren in this family, but they were equal to half a dozen, being lively, droll little chaps full of all manner of pranks and considered by their relatives the most remarkable boys alive. These 2 fellows were quite bursting with the great secrets of the day and had to rush out as soon as breakfast was done in order to keep from letting the cat out of the bag. Terrible, terrible phrase. Who keeps cats in bags? Right? Yeah. A fine dinner was cooked, and Grandma's favorite niece came to eat it with her, bringing a bag full of goodies and a heart full of love and kind wishes to the old lady. All the afternoon, friends and presents kept coming, and Madame, in her best gown and most imposing cap, sat in state to receive them. A poet came with some lovely flowers. The doctor brought a fine picture. One neighbor sent her basket of grapes, and some poor children whom Grandma had clothed and helped sent her some nuts that they had picked all themselves, while the grateful mother brought a bottle of cream and a dozen eggs. It was very pleasant, and the bright autumn day was a little harvest time for the old lady who had sowed love and charity, which she had broadcast with no thought of any reward. The tea table was ornamented with a splendid cake, white as snow outside, but rich and plummy inside, with a happy posy stuck atop the little Mount Blanc. Mrs. Trott, the housekeeper, made and presented it, and it was so pretty. All voted not to cut it till evening, for the table was full of other good things. Grandma's tea was extra strong and tasted unusually nice, with Miss Hawsey's rich cream in it. She felt that she needed this refreshment to prepare her for the grand surprise to come, for the family gifts were not yet given. The boys vanished directly after tea, and shouts of laughter were heard from Aunt Tribulation's room. What larks as they had up there no one knew, but everyone was sure they were preparing some fun in honor of the occasion. Grandma was not allowed to go into the study, and much tacking and rummaging went on for a time. Then all the lamps were collected there, leaving Grandma and Grandpa to sit in the parlor, talking tenderly together by the soft glimmer of firelight as they used to do 40 years ago. Presently, something scarlet and gold, feathery and strange, flitted by the door and vanished in the study. Can I turn the page, dude? I need that. Yeah. Yeah, something colorful flitted by the door and vanished in the study. Queer little yells and the sound of dancing feet were heard. Then there was a hunt for the cat. Next, Miss Trott was called from the kitchen, and all but the boys came to escort Grandma to the scene of glory. Leaning on Grandpa's arm, she marched first. Then came Miss Kubity, the mother of the boys, bearing Aunt Carmine's picture, for this auntie was over the water and could not come. So, at Grandma's desire, her portrait was borne in the procession. Aunt Trib followed, escorted by Thomas Pibb, the great cat, with his best red bow on. Wolfgang, by the way, will not wear a bow under any circumstances. He will, however, shred them by the half dozen. Mrs. Trott and Belinda, the little maid, brought up the rear. A music box in the hall played the Grand March from Norma, and with great dignity, all filed into the study to behold an imposing spectacle. A fire burned brightly on the hearth, making the old-fashioned andirons shine like gold. All the lamps illuminated the room, which was trimmed with scarlet and yellow leaves. An arch of red woodbine, evergreen, and ferns from the White Mountains was made over the recess which held the journals, letters, and books of the family. For their name was Penn, P-E-N-N, and they all wrote so much that ink blots were found everywhere about the house, and a flock of geese lived in the backyard, all ready to have their quills tweaked out at a minute's notice. Clearly, ballpoints were not yet available. Before this recess stood a great armchair in which the father of Grandma had been laid as a newborn baby and nearly smothered by being sat upon by the fat nurse. This thrilling fact gave it peculiar interest to the boys, for if great-grandpa had been smashed, where would they have been? In front of this ancient seat stood a round table loaded with gifts, and on each side stood an Indian chief in full costume, bearing lighted Chinese lanterns on the ends of their spears and war clubs on their shoulders. The arranging of these costumes had caused much labor and fun, for the splendid crowns, a foot high, were made of hen's feathers, carefully collected and sewed onto paper by Aunt Trib. The red shirts were fringed and bedecked with odd devices. Leather leggings went above the warriors' knees, and all the family breastpins were stuck about them. Daggers, hatchets, clubs, and spears were made by the lads themselves, and red army blankets hung gracefully from their shoulders. They had planned to paint their faces blue and red, like the Fiji Islanders at Barnum's show, but Miss Cubity would not consent to have her handsome boys disfigure themselves. So the only paint they wore was nature's red in their cheeks and heaven's blue in their eyes as they stood by Grandma's throne, smiling like a pair of very mild and happy little chiefs. It really was a fine sight, I assure you. And Grandma was quite overcome by the spectacle. So, she was introduced to her gifts as quickly as possible to divert her mind from the tender thought that all these fond and foolish adornments were to please her. Every gift had a poem attached, and as the presents were of every description, the verses possessed an agreeable variety. Here are a few as a sample. A small tea kettle was one gift, and this pleasing verse seemed to be bubbling out of its spout. A little kettle, fat and fair, to sit on Grandma's stove, to simmer softly, and to sing a song of Freddie's love. Another was this brief warning tucked into a matchbox. On this you scratch your little match. When the spark flies, look out for your eyes. When the lucifer goes, look out for your nose. Little Jack gives you this with a birthday kiss. A third was rather sentimental from Miss Cubity. Within doth lie a silken tie, to dress, to deck, soft and warm as daughter's arm round mother's neck. Mr. Pibb, are you listening? This is where the cat comes in. Yeah, you with me? Okay. Mr. Pibb presented a mousetrap. And in order to explain his poem, I must relate an incident in his varied career. That's right. The cat both gave a mousetrap as a present and wrote a poem to go with it. Yeah, he's with us. Pibb had long been one of the family and was much respected and beloved by them all. In fact, he was so petted and stuffed that he grew as fat and big as a small dog, and so clumsy that he could no longer catch the mice who dodged about amongst the dishes and in the kitchen closets. No, that part doesn't apply to you. He could definitely catch mice if we had any in the cabin. In vain had Miss Trot shut him up in there. In vain had Aunt Trib told him it was his duty to clear the cupboards of such small deer. Poor fat Pibb only bounced about, broke the china, rattled down the pans to come out with empty paws, while the saucy mice squeaked scornfully and pranced about under his very nose. One day, Aunt Trib saw Pibb catch a squirrel, and having eaten it, he brought the tail to her as a trophy of his skill. This displeased his mistress, and she gave him away after a good scolding for killing squirrels and letting mice, his lawful prey, go free. Gave the cat away. Ooh. Pibb was so depressed that he went into the bag without a mew or scratch and was borne away to his new home in another part of the town. You hear that? They put him in a bag to take him and give him away. What awful people. No, what an awful person. It was just the auntie. But he had no intention of staying. And after a day under the sofa, he paused in deep thought, and without food or drink, he made up his mind to go home. Slipping out, he traveled all night and appeared the next morning joyfully waving his tail and purring like a small organ. Aunt Trib was glad to see him. And when he had explained that he really did do his best about the mice, she forgave him and got the trap for him to give to Grandma, that she might no longer be annoyed by having her private stores nibbled at. This is from Pib. Dear Madam, with respect, my offering I bring, the hooks all baited well and ready for a spring. No more the cunning mice your biscuits shall abuse, nor put their babies to sleep within your fur-lined shoes. The trap my work must do, forgive your portly cat, for he, like you, has grown for lively work too fat. All larger, fiercer game I gallantly defy, and squirrel, rat, and mole beneath my paw shall die. So, with this solemn vow, T. Pib his gift presents, and sprawling at your feet, purrs forth his compliments. Isn't that awesome? The cat wrote the best poem of all of them. Yeah. Which he actually did, and then sat bolt upright on the rug, surveying the scene with the dignity of a judge and the gravity of an owl. Such funny presents. A wood box and a water carrier, a blue and gold gruel bowl, and a black silk apron, a new diary, and a pound of remarkably choice tea. A pretty letter on birch bark, sealed with a tiny red leaf, and a bust of the wisest man in America were some of them. Interesting, this is not an edit. She doesn't actually say who the bust of the wisest man of America depicts. Avoiding controversy, clearly. How the dear old lady did enjoy it all, and how grateful she was for the smallest trifle. An old friend sent her a lock of her mother's hair, and the sight of the little brown curl made her forget how white her own was, as she went back to the time when she last kissed that tender little mother 50 years ago. Fearing that tears would follow the smiles too soon, Aunt Trib announced that the famous Indian chiefs Ching Cheng Popocatty Puddle and Paki Haki Clutter would now give a war dance and other striking performances to represent Indian customs. Then, all sat round, and the warriors leapt into the middle of the room with a war whoop that caused Mr. Pib to leave precipitously. It was the most exciting spectacle, for after the dance came a fight, and one chief tomahawked, scalped, and buried the other in the space of 2 minutes. But the ladies mourned so for the blonde little Pocky Hockey Clutter that he had to come alive again and join in a hunting expedition during which they shot all the chairs for buffalo and deer and came home to roast a sofa pillow over their fire and feast thereupon with the relish of hungry hunters. These exploits were brought to an end by the arrival of more friends with more gifts and the introduction of the birthday cake. This was cut by the Queen of the Fate, and the panting chiefs handed it round with much scuffling of big moccasins and tripping over disarranged blankets. Then, all filled their glasses with water and drank the toast. "Grandma, God bless her." After which the entire company took hands and danced about the big chair, singing in chorus, "Long may she wave, and may we all hear her dear face live to see, as bright and well at 74 as now at 73. The clock struck 10, and everyone went home, leaving the family to end the day as they began it, round Grandma's bed, with goodnight kisses and the sound of her last words in their ears. She said, "It has been a beautiful and happy day, my dears, and if I never see another, you may always remember that I thought this one my best and brightest birthday." Who is Vanilla Ice's grandpa? That's clearly the punchline to something that I missed. Vanilla Ice's name is Rob Van Winkle. Okay. There you go. Hey, about a year and a half ago or so, I had a radio call-in job where I was, my character description was Miami douchebag. Not kidding. That's really what I think maybe they gave me like an age and an ethnicity as well, but the real description that jumps out at me is you're calling in to a Miami radio station as a Miami douchebag. And so the only resource I could think of for this was to go onto YouTube and just absorb every interview with Vanilla Ice that I could possibly find. And I basically called in doing kind of a half impression of Vanilla Ice, but I was really just getting the way he talked without imitating his voice in particular. So that was I learned a lot more about Vanilla Ice in one night than I ever intended to know. This this story takes place in the pre- and post-colonial Americas. So this takes place right around 1776. That'll be relevant. But interestingly enough, it was written a long time ago. It was written in 1905. I love to look at authors that were writing a long time ago, but I'll say it slightly different. I like to read authors who were writing from their perspective what was a long time ago, but who lived from my perspective a long time ago. So, first published in 1905, this is Rip Van Winkle by Washington Irving. So this starts with a little bit of a preamble. This was included in the original publication, and it goes like this. A posthumous writing of Dietrich Knickerbocker. The following tale was found among the papers of the late Dietrich Knickerbocker, an old gentleman of New York who was very curious in the Dutch history of the province and the manners of the descendants from its primitive settlers. His historical researches, however, did not lie so much among books as among men, for the former are lamentably scanty on his favorite topics, whereas he found the old burghers, and still more their wives, rich in that legendary lore so invaluable to true history. Whenever, therefore, he happened upon a genuine Dutch family, snugly shut up in its low-roofed farmhouse under a spreading sycamore, he looked upon it as a little clasped volume of black letter and studied it with the zeal of a bookworm. The result of all these researches was a history of the province during the reign of the Dutch governors, which he published some years since. There have been various opinions as to the literary character of his work, and to tell the truth, it is not a whit better than it should be. Its chief merit is its scrupulous accuracy, which indeed was a little questioned on its first appearance, but has since been completely established, and it is now admitted into all historical collections as a book of unquestionable authority. The old gentleman died shortly after the publication of his work, and now that he is dead and gone, it cannot do much harm to his memory to say that his time might have been much better employed in weightier labors. He, however, was apt to ride his hobby his own way, and though it did now and then kick up the dust a little in the eyes of his neighbors and grieve the spirit of some friends for whom he felt the truest deference and affection, yet his errors and follies are remembered, quote, more in sorrow than in anger, and it begins to be suspected that he never intended to injure or offend. But however his memory may be appreciated by critics, it is still held dear among many folk whose good opinion is well worth having, particularly by certain biscuit bakers, who have gone so far as to imprint his likeness on their New Year cakes, and have thus given him a chance for immortality almost equal to the being stamped on a Waterloo medal or a Queen Anne's farthing. Rip Van Winkle. Whoever has made a voyage up the Hudson must remember the Catskill Mountains. They are a dismembered branch of the great Appalachian family and are seen away to the west of the river, swelling up to a noble height and lording it over the surrounding country. Every change of season, every change of weather, indeed every hour of the day produces some change in the magical hues and shapes of these mountains, and they are regarded by all the good wives, far and near, as perfect barometers. When the weather is fair and settled, they're clothed in blue and purple, and print their bold outlines in the clear evening sky. But sometimes, when the rest of the landscape is cloudless, they will gather a hood of gray vapors about their summits, which, in the last rays of the setting sun, will glow and light up like a crown of glory. At the foot of these fairy mountains, the voyager may have described the light smoke curling up from a village, whose shingle roofs gleam among the trees, just where the blue tints of the upland melt away into the fresh green of the nearer landscape. It is a little village of great antiquity, having been founded by some of the Dutch colonists in the early times of the province, just about the beginning of the government of the good Peter Stuyvesant, may he rest in peace. And there were some of the houses of the original settlers standing within a few years, built of small yellow bricks brought from Holland, having latticed windows and gable fronts surmounted with weathercocks. In that same village, and in one of these very houses, which, to tell the precise truth, was sadly time-worn and weather-beaten, there lived, many years since, while the country was still yet a province of Great Britain, a simple, good-natured fellow of the name of Rip Van Winkle. He was a descendant of the Van Winkles, related to Vanilla Ice as so far as we are concerned, who figured so gallantly in the chivalrous days of Peter Stuyvesant and accompanied him to the siege of Fort Christina. He inherited, however, very little of the martial character of his ancestors. I've observed that he was a simple, good-natured man. He was, moreover, a kind neighbor and an obedient, henpecked husband. Indeed, to the latter circumstance might be owing that meekness of spirit which gained him such universal popularity, for those men are most apt to be obsequious and conciliating abroad, who are under the discipline of shrews at home. Their tempers, doubtless, are rendered pliant and malleable in the fiery furnace of domestic tribulation, and a curtain lecture is worth all the sermons in the world for teaching the virtues of patience and long suffering. A termagant wife may, therefore, in some respects, be considered a tolerable blessing, and if so, Rip Van Winkle was thrice blessed. Certain it is that he was a great favorite among all the good wives of the village, who, as usual with the amiable sex, took his part in all family squabbles and never failed, whenever they talked those matters over in their evening gossipings, to lay all the blame on Dame Van Winkle. That's his wife. The children of the village, too, would shout with joy whenever he approached. He assisted at their sports. He made their playthings, taught them to fly kites, shoot marbles, told them long stories of ghosts, witches, and Indians. Whenever he went dodging about the village, he was surrounded by a troop of them hanging on his skirts, clambering on his back, and playing 1,000 tricks on him with impunity, and not a dog would bark at him throughout the entire neighborhood. The great error in Rip's composition was an insuperable aversion to all kinds of profitable labor. It could not be from the want of assiduity or perseverance, for he would sit on a wet rock with a rod as long and heavy as a Tartar's lance and fish all day without a murmur, even though he should not be encouraged by a single nibble. He would carry a fowling piece on his shoulder for hours together. That's an old word for a gun that you shoot waterfowl with, birds. Trudging through woods and swamps and uphill and down dale to shoot a few squirrels or wild pigeons, he would never refuse to assist a neighbor, even in the roughest toil, and was a foremost man at all country frolics for husking Indian corn or building stone fences. The women of the village, too, used to employ him to run their errands and to do such little odd jobs as their less obliging husbands would not do for them. In a word, Rip was ready to attend to anybody's business but his own. But as to doing family duty and keeping his farm in order, he found it impossible. In fact, he declared it was of no use to work on his farm. It was the most pestilent little piece of ground in the whole country, and everything about it went wrong and would go wrong in spite of him. His fences were continually falling to pieces. His cow would either go astray or get among the cabbages. Weeds were sure to grow quicker in his fields than anywhere else. The rain always made a point of settling in just as he had some outdoor work to do. Though his patrimonial estate had dwindled away under his management, acre by acre, until there was little more left than a mere patch of Indian corn and potatoes, yet it was the worst conditioned farm in all the neighborhood. His children, too, were as ragged and wild as if they belonged to nobody. His son, Rip, an urchin begotten in his own likeness, promised to inherit the habits with the old clothes of his father. He was generally seen trooping like a colt at his mother's heels, equipped in a pair of his father's cast-off Galaskins, which he had much ado to hold up with one hand, as a fine lady does with her dress train in bad weather. Rip Van Winkle, however, was one of those happy mortals of foolish and well-oiled dispositions who take the world easy, eat white bread or brown, whichever can be got with least thought or trouble, and would rather starve on a penny than work for a pound. If left to himself, he would have whistled life away in perfect contentment. But his wife kept continually dinning in his ears about his idleness, his carelessness, and the ruin he was bringing on his family. Morning, noon, and night, her tongue was incessantly going, and everything he said or did was sure to produce a torrent of household eloquence. Rip had but one way to reply to all lectures of the kind, and that, by frequent use, had grown into a habit. He shrugged his shoulders, shook his head, cast up his eyes, but said nothing. This, however, always provoked a fresh volley from his wife, so that he was fain to draw off his forces and take to the outside of the house, the only side which, in truth, belongs to the hen-pecked husband. Rip's sole domestic adherence was his dog, Wolf, who was as much henpecked as his master, for Dame Van Winkle regarded them as companions in idleness, and even looked upon Wolf with an evil eye as the cause of his master's going so often astray. True it is, in all points of spirit befitting an honorable dog, he was as courageous an animal as ever scoured the woods, but what courage can withstand the evil doing and all besetting terrors of a woman's tongue? The moment Wolf entered the house, his crest fell, his tail drooped to the ground or curled between his legs. He sneaked about with the gallows air, casting many a sidelong glance at Dame Van Winkle, and at the least flourish of a broomstick or ladle, he would fly to the door with yelping precipitation. Times grew worse and worse with Rip Van Winkle as years of matrimony rolled on. A tart temper never mellows with age, and a sharp tongue is the only edged tool that grows keener with constant use. For a long while, he used to console himself when driven from home by frequenting a kind of perpetual club of the sages, philosophers, and other idle personages of the village. This same club held its sessions on a bench before a small inn, designated by a rubicund portrait of His Majesty George III. This would have been the same king from Hamilton. Here, they used to sit in the shade through a long, lazy summer's day, talking listlessly over village gossip or telling endless, sleepy stories about nothing. But it would have been worth any statesman's money to have heard the profound discussions that sometimes took place when by chance an old newspaper fell into their hands from some passing traveler. How solemnly they would listen to the contents as drawled out by Derek Van Brummel, the schoolmaster, a dapper, little learned man, who was not to be daunted by the most gigantic word in the dictionary, and how sagely they would deliberate upon public events some months after they had taken place. The opinions of this junto were completely controlled by Nicholas Vedder, a patriarch of the village, who was probably not related to Eddie Vedder, later of Pearl Jam, but was landlord of the inn, at the door of which he took his seat from morning till night, just moving sufficiently to avoid the sun and keep in the shade of a large tree so that the neighbors could tell the hour by his movements as accurately as by a sundial. It is true, he was rarely heard to speak, but smoked his pipe incessantly. His adherents, however, for every great man has his adherents, perfectly understood him and knew how to gather his opinions. When anything that was read or related displeased him, he was observed to smoke his pipe vehemently and to send forth short, frequent, and angry puffs. But when pleased, he would inhale the smoke slowly and tranquilly and emit it in light and placid clouds, and sometimes, taking the pipe from his mouth and letting the fragrant vapor curl about his nose, would gravely nod his head in token of perfect approbation. From even this stronghold, the unlucky Rip was at length routed by his termagant wife, who would suddenly break in upon the tranquility of the assemblage and call the members all to naught. Nor was that august personage, Nicholas Vedder himself, sacred from the daring tongue of this terrible virago who charged him outright with encouraging her husband in habits of idleness. Poor Rip was at last reduced almost to despair, and his only alternative to escape from the labor of the farm and the clamor of his wife was to take gun in hand and stroll away into the woods. Here, he would sometimes seat himself at the foot of a tree and share the contents of his wallet with Wolf, with whom he sympathized as a fellow sufferer in persecution. Poor Wolf, he would say, thy mistress leads thee a dog's life of it. But never mind, my lad. Whilst I live, thou shalt never want a friend to stand by thee. Wolf would wag his tail, look wistfully in his master's face, and if dogs can feel pity, I verily believe he reciprocated the sentiment with all his heart. In a long ramble of the kind on a fine autumnal day, Rip had unconsciously scrambled to one of the highest parts of the Catskills Mountains. He was after his favorite sport of squirrel shooting, and the still solitudes had echoed and re-echoed with the reports of his gun. Panting and fatigued, he threw himself late in the afternoon on a green knoll covered with mountain herbage that crowned the brow of a precipice. From an opening between the trees, he could overlook all the lower country for many a mile of rich woodland. He saw at a distance the lordly Hudson, far, far below him, moving on its silent but majestic course with the reflection of a purple cloud or the sail of a lagging bark here and there sleeping on its glassy bosom, and at last losing itself in the blue highlands. On the other side, he looked down into a deep mountain glen, wild, lonely, and shagged, the bottom filled with fragments from the impending cliffs and scarcely lighted by the reflected rays of the setting sun. For some time, Rip lay musing on this scene. Evening was gradually advancing. The mountains began to throw their long, blue shadows over the valleys. He saw that it would be dark long before he could reach the village, and he heaved a heavy sigh when he thought of encountering the terrors of Dame Van Winkle. As he was about to descend, he heard a voice from a distance hallooing, "Rip Van Winkle! Rip Van Winkle!" He looked around, but he could see nothing but a crow winging its solitary flight across the mountain. He thought his fancy must have deceived him and turned again to descend when he heard the same cry ring through the still evening air. "Rip Van Winkle! Rip Van Winkle!" At the same time, Wolf bristled up his back and, giving a low growl, skulked to his master's side, looking fearfully down into the glen. Rip now felt a vague apprehension stealing over him. He looked anxiously in the same direction and perceived a strange figure slowly toiling up the rocks and bending under the weight of something he carried on his back. He was surprised to see any human being in this lonely and infrequented place, but supposing it to be someone of the neighborhood in need of his assistance, he hastened down to help him. On nearer approach, he was still more surprised at the singularity of the stranger's appearance. He was a short, square-built old fellow with thick, bushy hair and a grizzled beard. His dress was of the antique Dutch fashion, a cloth jerkin strapped about his waist, several pairs of breeches, the outer one of ample volume decorated with rows of buttons down the sides and bunches at the knees. He bore on his shoulder a stout keg that seemed full of liquor and made signs for Rip to approach and assist him with the load. Though rather shy and distrustful of this new acquaintance, Rip complied with his usual alacrity, and mutually relieving one another, they clambered up a narrow gully, apparently the dry bed of a mountain torrent. As they ascended, Rip, every now and then, heard long, rolling peals like distant thunder that seemed to issue out of a deep ravine, or rather cleft between lofty rocks toward which their rugged path conducted. He paused for an instant, but supposing it to be the muttering of one of those transient thunder showers which often take place in the mountain heights, he proceeded. Passing through the ravine, they came to a hollow, like a small amphitheater surrounded by perpendicular precipices, over the brink of which impending trees shot their branches so that you only caught glimpses of the azure sky and the bright evening cloud. During that whole time, Rip and his companion had labored on in silence. For though Rip marveled greatly what could be the object of carrying a keg of liquor up this wild mountain, still there was something strange and incomprehensible about the unknown, and this inspired awe and checked familiarity. On entering the amphitheater, new objects of wonder presented themselves. On a level spot in the center was a company of odd-looking personages playing at ninepins. They were dressed in quaint, outlandish fashion. Some wore short doublets, others jerkins, with long knives in their belts, and most of them had enormous breeches of similar style with that of the guides. Their visages, too, were peculiar. One had a large head, a broad face, and small piggish eyes. The face of another seemed to consist entirely of nose and was surmounted by a white sugarloaf hat, set off with a little red cock's tail. They all had beards of various shapes and colors. There was one who seemed to be the commander. He was a stout old gentleman with a weather-beaten countenance. He wore a laced doublet, broad belt, and a sword hanger, high-crowned hat and feather red stockings, and high-heeled shoes with roses in them. The whole group reminded Rip of the figures in an old Flemish painting. The one in the parlor of Dominie Saint Shaik, the village parson. The painting had been brought over from Holland at the time of the settlement. What seemed particularly odd to Rip was that even though these folks were evidently amusing themselves, they still maintained the gravest face, the most mysterious silence, and they were the most melancholy party of pleasure he had ever witnessed. Nothing interrupted the stillness of the scene but the noise of the rolling balls, which echoed along the mountains like rumbling peals of thunder. As Rip and his companion approached the folk, they suddenly desisted from their play and stared at him with such fixed, statue-like gaze and such strange, uncouth, lackluster countenances that his heart turned within him and his knees smote together. His companion now emptied the contents of the keg into large flagons and made signs to him to wait upon the company. He obeyed with fear and trembling. They quaffed the liquor in profound silence and then returned to their game. By degrees, Rip's awe and apprehension subsided. He even ventured, when no eye was fixed upon him, to taste the beverage, which he found had much of the flavor of excellent Holland beer. He was naturally a thirsty soul, and soon tempted to repeat the draught. One taste provoked another, and he reiterated his visits to the flagon so often that at length his senses were overpowered. His eyes swam in his head gradually declined, and he fell into a deep sleep. On waking, he found himself on the green knoll whence he had first seen the old man of the glen. He rubbed his eyes. It was a bright sunny morning. The birds were hopping and twittering among the bushes, and an eagle was wheeling aloft and breasting the pure mountain breeze. Surely, thought Rip, I've not slept here all night. He recalled the occurrences before he fell asleep, the strange man with a keg of liquor, the mountain ravine, the wild retreat among the rocks, the woebegone party at Ninepins, the flagon. Oh, that flagon, that wicked, wicked flagon, thought Rip. What excuse shall I make to Dame Van Winkle? He looked around for his gun, but in place of the clean, well-oiled fowling piece, he found an old firelock lying by him. The barrel encrusted with rust, the lock falling off, the stock worm-eaten. He now suspected that the grave roisterers of the mountain had put a trick upon him, and having dosed him with liquor, had robbed him of his gun. Wolf, too, had disappeared, but he might have strayed away after a squirrel or partridge. He whistled after him and shouted his name, but all in vain. The echoes repeated his whistle and shout, but no dog was to be seen. He determined to revisit the scene of the last evening's gamble, and if he met with any of the party, to demand his dog and his gun. As he rose to walk, he found himself stiff in the joints and wanting in his usual activity. These mountain beds do not agree with me, thought Riff. And if this frolic should lay me up with a fit of the rheumatism, I shall have a blessed time with Dame Van Winkle. With some difficulty, he got down into the glen. He found the gully up which he and his companion had ascended the previous evening, but to his astonishment, a mountain stream was now foaming down it, leaping from rock to rock, and filling the glen with babbling murmurs. He, however, made shift to scramble up its sides, working his toilsome way through the thickets of birch, sassafras, and witch hazel. He was sometimes tripped up or entangled by the wild grapevines that twisted their coils and tendrils from tree to tree to spread a kind of network in his path. At length, he reached to where the ravine had opened through the cliffs to the amphitheater, but no traces of such opening remained. The rocks presented a high, impenetrable wall over which the torrent came tumbling in a sheet of feathery foam and fell into a broad, deep basin, black from the shadows of the surrounding forest. Here, then, poor Rip was brought to a stand. Here again, called and whistled after his dog, he was only answered by the cawing of a flock of idle crows, sporting high in the air above a dry tree that overhung a sunny precipice, and who seemed to look down and scoff at the poor man's perplexities. What was to be done? The morning was passing away, and Rip felt famished for want of his breakfast. He grieved to give up his dog and gun. He dreaded to meet his wife. But it would not do to starve among the mountains. He shook his head, shouldered the rusty firelock, and, with a heart full of trouble and anxiety, turned his steps homeward. He approached the village, and as he approached the village, he met a number of people, but none of whom he knew, which somewhat surprised him, for he had thought himself acquainted with everyone in the country round. Their dress, too, was of a different fashion from that to which he was accustomed, completely foreign, in fact. They all stared at him with equal marks of surprise, and whenever they cast their eyes upon him, invariably stroked their chins. The constant recurrence of this gesture induced Rip involuntarily to do the same, when, to his astonishment, he found his beard had grown a foot long. He had now entered the skirts of the village. A troop of strange children ran at his heels, hooting after him and pointing at his foot-long gray beard. The dogs, too, not one of which he recognized for an old acquaintance, barked at him as he passed. The very village was altered. It was larger and more populous. There were rows of houses which he had never seen before, and those which had been his familiar haunts had disappeared. Strange names were over the doors, strange faces at the windows. Everything was strange. His mind now misgave him. He began to doubt whether both he and the world around him were not bewitched. Surely this was his native village, which he had left but the day before. There stood the Catskill Mountains. There ran the River Hudson at a distance. There was every hill and dale precisely as it had always been. Rip was sorely perplexed. That flagon last night, thought he, has addled my poor head sadly. And let me tell you, what musician can't relate to that? It was with some difficulty that he found the way to his own house, which he approached with silent awe, expecting every moment to hear the shrill voice of Dame Van Winkle. He found the house gone to decay, the roof fallen in, the windows shattered, the doors off the hinges. A half-starved dog that looked like Wolf was skulking around it. Rip called him by name, but the cur snarled, showed his teeth, and passed on. This was an unkind cut indeed. My very dog, sighed poor Rip. My very dog has forgotten me. He entered the house, which, to tell the truth, Dame Van Winkle had always kept in neat order. It was empty, forlorn, apparently abandoned. This desolateness overcame all his connubial fears. He called loudly for his wife and children. The lonely chambers rang for a moment with his voice, and then all again was silence. He now hurried forth and hastened to his old resort, the village inn. But it too was gone. A large, rickety wooden building stood in its place, with great gaping windows, some of them broken and mended with old hats and petticoats, and over the door was painted "The Union Hotel" by Jonathan Doolittle. Instead of the great tree that used to shelter the quiet little Dutch inn of yore, there now was reared a tall, naked pole with something on top that looked like a red nightcap, and from it was fluttering a flag on which was a singular assemblage of stars and stripes. All this was strange and incomprehensible. He recognized on the sign, however, the ruby face of King George, under which he had smoked so many a peaceful pipe. But even this was singularly metamorphosed. The red coat was changed for one of blue and buff. A sword was held in the hand instead of a scepter. The head was decorated with a cocked hat, and underneath was painted in large characters, General Washington. There was, as usual, a crowd of folk about the door, but none that Rip recollected. The very character of the people seemed changed. There was a busy, bustling, disputatious tone about it, instead of the accustomed phlegm and drowsy tranquility. He looked in vain for the sage Nicholas Vedder, not Eddie's great-uncle, with his broad face, his double chin, and fair long pipe, uttering clouds of some form of probably tobacco smoke, instead of idle speeches or Van Brummel, the schoolmaster, doling forth the contents of an ancient newspaper. In place of these, a lean, bilious-looking fellow with his pockets full of handbills was haranguing vehemently about rights of citizens, elections, members of Congress, liberty, Bunker's Hill, heroes of 76, and in other words, which were a perfect Babylonish jargon to the bewildered Van Winkle. The appearance of Rip, with his long grizzled beard, his rusty fowling piece, his uncouth dress, and an army of women and children at his heels, soon attracted the tavern politicians. They crowded round him, eyeing him from head to foot with great curiosity. The orator bustled up to him and, drawing him partly aside, inquired on which side he had voted. Rip stared in vacant stupidity. Another short but busy little fellow pulled him by the arm and, rising on tiptoe, inquired in his ear whether he was Federal or Democrat. Rip was equally at a loss to comprehend the question when a knowing, self-important old gentleman in a sharp cocked hat made his way through the crowd, putting them to the right and left with his elbows as he passed, and planting himself before Van Winkle with one arm akimbo, the other resting on his cane, his keen, sharp eyes and sharp hat penetrating, as it were, into his very soul, demanded in an austere tone what brought him to the election with a gun on his shoulder and a mob at his heels, and whether he meant to breed a riot in the village. "Alas, gentlemen," cried Rip, somewhat dismayed, "I am a poor, quiet man, a native of the place, and a loyal subject of the king. God bless him." Here came a general short burst from the bystanders. "A Tory! A Tory! A spy! A refugee! Hustle him! Away with him! Hang him!" It was with the greatest difficulty that the self-important man in the cocked hat restored order, and, having assumed a tenfold austerity of brow, demanded again of the unknown culprit what he came there for, and whom was he seeking. Poor Rip humbly assured him that he meant no harm, but merely came there in search of some of his neighbors who used to keep about the tavern. "Well, who are they?" "Name them." Rip bethought himself a moment and inquired, "Where's Nicholas Vedder?" There was a silence for a little while, when an old man replied in a thin, piping voice, "Nicholas Vedder? Why, he is dead and gone these 18 years. There was a wooden tombstone in the churchyard that used to tell about him, but that's gone and rotten too." Where's Brom Dutcher?" "Oh, off he went to the army in the beginning of the war. Some say he was killed at the storming of Stony Point. Others say he was drowned in a squall at the foot of Anthony's Nose. I don't know. He never came back again." "Then where's Von Brummel, the schoolmaster?" "He went off to the wars, too. He was a great militia general, and now he's in Congress." Rip's heart died away at hearing of these sad changes in his home and friends, and finding himself thus alone in the world. Every answer puzzled him, too, by treating of such enormous lapses of time and matters which he could not understand. War, Congress, Stony Point. He had no courage to ask after any more friends, but cried out in despair, "Does nobody here know Dame Van Winkle? How about Rip Van Winkle?" Oh, Rip Van Winkle, exclaimed two or three. Oh, to be sure. That's Rip Van Winkle, over yonder, leaning against the tree. Rip looked and beheld a precise counterpart of himself as he had gone up the mountain, apparently as lazy and certainly as ragged. The poor fellow was now completely confounded. He doubted his own identity, whether he was himself or another man. In the midst of his bewilderment, the man in the cocked hat demanded who he was and what was his name. "God knows," exclaimed he at his wit's end. I'm not myself. I'm somebody else. That's me. Yonder? No, that's somebody else. Got into my shoes. I was myself last night, but I fell asleep on the mountain, and they've changed my gun, and everything's changed, and I'm changed, and I can't tell what's my name or who I am." The bystanders now began to look at each other, nod, wink significantly, and tap their fingers against their foreheads. There was a whisper, also, about securing the gun and keeping the old fellow from doing mischief, at the very suggestion of which the self-important man in the cocked hat retired with some precipitation. At this critical moment, a fresh, comely woman pressed through the throng to get a peep at the gray-bearded man. She had a chubby child in her arms, which, frightened at his looks, began to cry. "Hush, Rip," cried she. "Hush, you little fool. The old man won't hurt you." The name of the child, the air of the mother, the tone of her voice, all awakened a train of recollections in his mind. "What's your name, my good woman?" asked he. "Judith Gardenier." "And your father's name?" "Ah, poor man, Rip Van Winkle was his name. But it's 20 years since he went away from home with his gun, and has never been heard of since. His dog came home without him, but whether he shot himself or was carried away by the Indians, nobody can tell. I was then but a little girl." Rip had one more question to ask, but he put it with a faltering voice. "Where's your mother?" "Oh, she too had died but a short time since. She broke a blood vessel in a fit of passion at a New England peddler." There was a drop of comfort, at least, in this intelligence. The honest man could contain himself no longer. He caught his daughter and her child in his arms. "I'm your father," cried he. "Young Rip Van Winkle once. Old Rip Van Winkle now. Does nobody know poor Rip Van Winkle? All stood amazed until an old woman tottering out from among the crowd put her hand to her brow and, peering under it in his face for a moment, exclaimed, "Sure enough, it is Rip Van Winkle. It is himself. Welcome again, old neighbor. Where have you been these 20 long years?" Rip's story was soon told, for the whole 20 long years had been to him but as of one night. The neighbors stared when they heard it. Some were seen to wink at each other and put their tongues in their cheeks, and the self-important man in the cocked hat, who, when the alarm was over, had returned to the field, screwed down the corners of his mouth and shook his head, upon which there was a general shaking of the head throughout the assemblage. It was determined, however, to take the opinion of old Peter Vanderdonk, who was seen slowly advancing up the road. He was a descendant of the historian of that name, who wrote one of the earliest accounts of the province. Peter was the most ancient inhabitant of the village, and well versed in all the wonderful events and traditions of the neighborhood. He recollected Rip at once and corroborated his story in the most satisfactory manner. He assured the company that it was a fact, handed down from his ancestor, the historian, that the Catskill Mountains had always been haunted by strange little beings. That it was affirmed that the great Hendrik Hudson, the first discoverer, the first person who discovered the river and country, kept a kind of vigil there every 20 years, with his crew of the Half Moon, being permitted in this way to revisit the scenes of his enterprise and keep a guardian eye upon the river and the great city called by his name. That his father had once seen them in their old Dutch dresses playing at ninepins in a hollow of the mountains, and that he himself had heard one summer afternoon the sound of their rolling balls like distant peals of thunder. To make a long story short, the company broke up and returned to the more important concerns of the election. Rip's daughter took him home to live with her. She had a snug, well-furnished house and a stout, cheery farmer for a husband, whom Rip recollected as one of the urchins that used to climb upon his back. As to Rip's son and heir, who was the ditto of himself, seen leaning against the tree, he was employed to work on the farm, but evinced a hereditary disposition to attend to anything else but his own business. Rip now resumed his old walks and habits. He soon found many of his former cronies, though all rather the worse for the wear and tear of time, and preferred making friends among the rising generation, with whom he soon grew into great favor. Having nothing to do at home, and being arrived at that happy age when a man can be idle with impunity, that's the age that who sitting next to me has definitely arrived to, he took his place once more on the bench at the inn door, and was reverenced as one of the patriarchs of the village, and a chronicle of the old times before the war. It was some time before he could get back into the regular track of gossip, or could be made to comprehend the strange events that had taken place during his torpor. How that there had been a revolutionary war, that the country had thrown off the yoke of old England, and that Instead of being a subject to His Majesty George III, he was now a free citizen of the United States. Rip, in fact, was no politician. The changes of states and empires made but little impression on him. But there was one species of despotism under which he had long groaned, and that was petticoat government. Happily, that was at an end. He had got his neck out of the yoke of matrimony and could go in and out whenever he pleased without dreading the tyranny of Dame Van Winkle. Whenever her name was mentioned, however, he shook his head, he shrugged his shoulders, cast up his eyes, which might pass either for an expression of resignation to his fate or joy at his deliverance. He used to tell his story to every stranger that arrived at Mr. Doolittle's hotel. He was observed, at first, to vary on some points every time he told it, which was, doubtless, owing to his having so recently awakened. It at last settled down precisely to the tale I have related, and not a man, woman, or child in the neighborhood but knew it by heart. Some always pretended to doubt the reality of it and insisted that Rip had been out of his head, and that this was one point on which he always remained flighty. The old Dutch inhabitants, however, almost universally gave it full credit. Even to this day, they never hear a thunderstorm of a summer afternoon about the Catskills, but they say Henrik Hudson and his crew are at their game of ninepins. And it is a common wish of all hen-pecked husbands in the neighborhood, when life hangs heavy on their hands, that they might have a quieting draught out of Rip Van Winkle's flagon. This is a poem called The Snowman by Wallace Stevens. One must have a mind of winter to regard the frost in the boughs of the pine trees crusted with snow, and have been cold a long time to behold the junipers shagged with ice, the spruces rough in the distant glitter of the January sun, and not to think of any misery in the sound of the wind, in the sound of a few leaves, which is the sound of the land, full of the same wind that is blowing in the same bare place for the listener who listens in the snow, and nothing himself beholds nothing that is not there, and the nothing that is. So, this next author is brought to us twitching sleeping cat dreaming. I gotta say, I think the Harlem Renaissance is one of the most awesome names for any epoch, literary or otherwise. Langston Hughes lived from 1902 to 1967. He was a central figure in the Harlem Renaissance, the flowering of the black intellectual, literary, and artistic life that took place in the 1920s in a number of American cities, most especially Harlem. A major poet, Hughes also wrote novels, short stories, essays, and plays. This is one of my mom's favorite poems. And my earliest childhood memory of this particular poem, I read this for the first time when I was 11 years old in Tom Hawkins' music class because we were studying recorder, like the little plastic flute that a lot of us learn in like junior high or slightly early. And I was also learning melodies and how the melodies can go, how appropriately, metaphorically, from the white keys to the black keys on a piano. Oddly, I can remember that melody to this day as though I had just learned it last week, but it was set to Dreams by Langston Hughes. Hold fast to dreams, for if dreams die, life is a broken-winged bird that cannot fly. Hold fast to dreams, for when dreams go, life is a barren field covered with snow. In a very signature way, inspired the immortal Maya Angelou. I'm going to read you a poem by Lawrence Dunbar that I'm sure you will recognize. Even if you've never heard this poem before, you will instantly see what this poem later inspired. Published in 1899, this is Sympathy by Paul Laurence Dunbar. I know what the caged bird feels. Alas, when the sun is bright on the upland slopes, when the wind stirs soft through the springing grass, and the river flows like a stream of glass, when the first bird sings and the last bud opes and the faint perfume from its chalice steals, I know what the caged bird feels. I know why the caged bird beats his wing till its blood is red on the cruel bars, for he must fly back to his perch and cling when he fain would be on the bough a swing. And a pain still throbs in the old scars. They pulse again with a keener sting. I know why he beats his wing. I know why the caged bird sings. Ah, me, when his wing is bruised and his bosom sore, when he beats his bars and when he would be free, it is not a carol of joy or glee, but a prayer that he sends from his heart's deep core, but a plea that upward to heaven he flings. I know why the caged bird sings. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Fireside Tales with Wolfgang. To view more of my work, check out my YouTube channel at Hunter's Acoustic Cabin. Directed by Hunter Ackerman. Endorsed by Wolfgang Beastly. Produced by GWC Productions. Originally broadcast on GWC Productions' YouTube channel, CAPS Media Television Channel 6, KPPQ LP Ventura at 104.1 FM, and on the KPPQ Podcast Network.